Everyone, good morning from Dhaka, Bangladesh. I welcome you to this webinar on COVID-19 and gender-based violence. My name is Shahriar Sadat. I am from the Human Rights and Legal Aid Services at BRAC. This webinar is hosted by the Center for Development Economics and Sustainability, CDES, at Monash Business School. On behalf of the CDS and BRAC, I welcome you all. The Monash University's Australian campuses, they stand at various lands, and the university acknowledges the traditional custodians and also pays its tributes to the elders of the past, present, and the emerging ones. As we all know, that this webinar is part of CDE's ongoing series of COVID-19 and beyond. It is to provide a forum for discussion on the huge economic and social ramifications of the pandemic. The priorities that policymakers will have to fix for the future to respond to developing and developing countries. As we have seen all over the world, that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a very distinct gendered impact, which has exacerbated the effects of pre-existing toxic social norms and gender inequalities. We have seen reports which show that since the pandemic, there had been a huge upsurge of gender-based violence in both developed and developing countries. Lockdowns and movement restrictions in particular have enhanced risks for women and girls as gender-based violence occurs, most commonly in the victim's own home. We are delighted to have a panel of experts to discuss the issues and challenges posed by this increase in GBV and explore policy options and strategies to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. After the discussion by the panelists, there will be a Q&A session, and we would request everyone to put their questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom option, and also you can do it all through the discussion. The moderator for today's webinar is Professor Jackie True. Professor Jackie True is a professor of international relations and director of Monash University's Center for Gender, Peace and Security. Monash GPS aims to contribute globally recognized gender inclusive research, evidence, education and training to deliver peace and security globally in partnership with government and non-governmental organizations. She is an Australian Research Council Future Fellow and a Global Fellow, Peace Research Institute of Oslo. Jackie's research interests are in women's peace participation, gender-based violence in situations of conflict and crisis, and gender and preventing violent extremism. She is the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Women, Peace and Security, which was published in 2019, and Violence Against Women, What Everyone Needs to Know, which was published in 2020. I would like to now pass it on to Professor Jackie True to give her introduction. Over to you, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sadat, for that introduction, and welcome to our audience and to today's webinar on COVID-19 and gender-based violence. Before I go ahead and introduce our three fantastic expert speakers today, I'd just like to say a few more words about the topic of our discussion. So as I think has partly already been said, what is remarkable about 2020 is that across the world, in every country, regardless of its level of development and wealth or the type of government, and socio-cultural norms, restrictive public health measures to control the spread of COVID-19 have increased women's vulnerability to all forms of gender-based violence. It's been a striking universal pattern, although clearly not all people and not all women have been affected in exactly the same way. Nonetheless, this pattern of violence within and across countries is remarkable. And of course, it was already occurring prior to COVID-19, but what is significant, I think, is the particular impacts of the COVID restrictions and the economic recession and fallout as a result of the restrictions. So this year, while the World Health Organization in many countries worldwide responded to the COVID pandemic by encouraging and in fact requiring people to stay home and stay safe, what we know, based on research by a number of scholars, but also importantly by the UN Office for Drugs and Crime in their annual surveys of homicide and violence, is that the home is the most likely place for women to be killed worldwide. And that is even in conflict zones for women, the home is nonetheless the least safe place. And with more people confined to their homes, in whatever context this year, in order to reduce the community spread of COVID-19, the risk of violence against women and children has escalated. And based on the early analysis of the impact of the COVID restrictions in a number of countries, and especially in conflict and displacement settings, as well as in stable democracies, already in April this year, the United Nations reported that violence against women was a shadow pandemic. And off the back of that declaration, which really raised, I think, the profile and the visibility of this violence occurring, the UN Population Fund predicted, based on its forecast modeling, that for every 3 months that there was a government-enforced COVID-19 restriction, an additional 15 million cases of domestic violence, that is gender-based violence in the home, would occur worldwide. So today I'm hoping that we're going to discuss why is this the case and what forms does gender-based violence take in different countries? Why and how is gender-based violence, which was already at epidemic levels globally before this year, has it been affected by COVID-19, not just in terms of increases, but in other ways as well? And more importantly, how safe, if home is the least safe place for most women, how safe is it for different groups of women and girls, as well as men and boys? And also, I think really important, because today we have an economist among one of our experts, and we of course are being hosted by the Centre for Development Economics at Monash. What are the impacts of the economic crisis that's resulted from COVID-19 on gender-based violence, not only at home, but at work and in public spaces? And finally, how far and in what ways do government responses take into account the shadow pandemic and its causes? For example, some Swedish experts have argued that one of the reasons their country did not go forth with a strict lockdown was in part because of their awareness of the likely impacts on gender-based violence. So at a time of really high risk for women experiencing violence, it seems to be really a significant issue for governments to consider. And surprisingly, it was not something considered from the outset this year, despite the fact that we already had a significant knowledge and research base about how crises, including economic crises, but also disasters, exacerbate violence against women, including violence against women in the homes. So I'm really happy today to be able to chair this really interdisciplinary panel with our 3 speakers, all experts in their own fields, to address some of these questions and concerns. And our three speakers today specifically, work in the fields of economics, law and criminology, and come from three different countries, Australia, India and Bangladesh. So let me now introduce them to you. First of all, I'd like to introduce, and it is my pleasure to welcome to Monash, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, who is Professor of Economics and the founding director of the Centre for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University in India. She is well known for her scholarship on poverty, inequality, regional disparities, and gender discrimination. And in fact, her PhD and early publications looked at the international debt crisis in the 1980s and subsequently at the global economic crisis and its impact on the developing world. She's also worked on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action with a particular focus on caste and gender in India. And she's the author of a number of significant books published by Oxford University Press. And I just mentioned two: Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India, and Affirmative Action in India. It's wonderful to have you with us, Professor Deshpande. I'll just introduce our other two speakers and then I'll come back to you to start with your comments on today's webinar. So next we have, and I'm very happy to welcome today, Jennifer Jabbar, who is from BRAC, the largest non-governmental organisation in the development field in Bangladesh. And Jennifer joined BRAC in 2019 as the Director of Human Rights and Legal Aid Services and Social Compliance. She also heads the Sexual Harassment Committee at BRAC and is the legal advisor on safeguarding at BRAC. And through the program there, support is provided to vulnerable women and children in the community who've been victims and survivors of domestic violence and violence in the community through 408 legal aid clinics. She also provides and oversees safeguarding training and support to educational institutions, workplaces, and manufacturing industries. Jennifer has a really significant career in the field of human rights and corporate social responsibility. And prior to joining BRAC, she worked for JCPenney Purchasing across South Asia, Middle East and Africa, and also for the UNDP, for the International Labour Organization, for Tesco, Gap, and so on. She practiced law as an advocate in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh for more than 9 years and as a barrister at law from Lincoln's Inn, UK. Welcome, Jennifer. It's wonderful to have you here with us today. And last, I'd like to introduce my colleague and sometime collaborator as well, Dr. Naomi Fitzner, who is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre. And Naomi has led a project on violence against women as part of the Monash University-wide Melbourne Experiment Initiative, which is looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on the city and how we can learn to build back better and increase the sustainability and inclusiveness of Melbourne. Naomi is soon to be a lecturer in criminology at Monash starting next year, 2021. She completed her doctorate at Melbourne University in 2016 and was appointed as a postdoctoral researcher with the Gendered Violence and Abuse Research Alliance at RMIT University. Naomi has extensive research experience working with both government and non-government partners in family violence prevention and response in Australia. She conducts research right across the field of family violence, gender, family studies, social policy and law. But a key focus for her has been on the primary prevention of family violence, and her PhD examined men's engagement with intimate partner violence primary prevention programs. It's great to have you with us, Naomi. Thank you so much for joining and representing Monash here. Well, each of you now has, each speaker will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, based on the work that they've been doing this year and their analysis of gender-based violence during COVID-19 and in the response. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Deshpande to make her comments first. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. The only thing I will say is that I'm not an expert on this topic. I work on employment discrimination, etc. I have been looking at the gender-based violence figures, but I'm certainly not an expert, but I'm here to learn. And I would like to share with you some thoughts based upon some data that I've started looking at recently, and some writings that I had done in the beginning of the pandemic. So, you know, the context has been very excellently explained by Jackie, and I don't need to repeat that. So the shadow pandemic is real. It's seen in every country, regardless of social norms or levels of development. And I think that's a very telling commentary on the state of the world. You know, there's always a focus on social norms as explaining outcomes. But here we see actually that they don't, the differences in social norms do not explain this outcome, or put it another way, this seems to be the social norm everywhere, which is a bit frightening. Now, the point that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the estimates that we are seeing from different countries are most likely to be underestimates of the actual incidence of violence, because of the fact that Jackie highlighted, which is that most of the violence takes place inside the home of the victim. And so intimate partner violence or domestic violence at the best of times is underreported. It's very hard for women and children, and even boys and men for that matter, to report somebody that they are close to when violence is inside the house and there is no witness often and there's no proof. So even when everything is normal, this kind of violence is severely underreported. And in the pandemic, that's going to be more likely to be true. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind when we look at figures on domestic violence. So for example, UN Women has been very vocal and consistently producing material highlighting this issue. And you know, it asked for data from several countries and didn't actually get too many responses. But here is a graph from one of their reports. And you see, you know, calls to shelters, you know, complaints with shelters, police, health centers, other agencies, helplines, etc. And they divide these complaints as, you know, having increased during the pandemic, decreased, or no change. And you see that calls to helplines in 15 countries have increased. But this should not be interpreted to read as, you know, as showing that it's only in these 15 countries that there's been an increase. What I'm trying to point out is that you might have no change or decrease in other countries as well, but it's just a question of, are the victims of physical, of abuse able to report the violent incident precisely because of the needs of social distancing and physical distancing. These are figures after the physical distancing norms started to become more established in different countries. Now, why might we think that violence might have increased during COVID? Of course, there are several reasons for that. And the biggest sort of the overarching set of reasons have to do with the social and economic consequences of the pandemic that have meant a loss of income, loss of economic opportunity for a staggeringly large number of families. People have lost jobs. Those who still have jobs have had to face income cut downs. Food security has been an issue. So literally, you don't know where your next meal is coming from. Migrant populations, particularly internal migrants, as we see in India, have been placed at extreme hardship because the places of their work were shut down and they had to migrate under very difficult circumstances. And because of the needs of social distancing and physical distancing, even access to shelters, the alternative space that victims of abuse could have approached, that has been compromised. So there is the risk factors for exacerbating violence are all present under COVID. At the same time, the access to shelters or cushioning or safety nets for victims of violence have been severely compromised. And in general, access to safety nets is an issue for large segments of the population everywhere that have had to deal with the disastrous negative economic consequences of the pandemic. I have been doing some work with my colleague and co-author Kanika Mahajan at Ashoka University and Ishan Bansal, who's our student at Ashoka. So three of us have been looking at data, trying to find data on violence against women. Now, the issue is that the National Crime Records Bureau of India that keeps this data typically releases these figures with a 2-year lag. So especially at a time when we need the data immediately in real time, we are actually constrained by the fact that there are no numbers, we don't know. So what we have been doing is whichever states have first information reports, these are complaints that people make to the police stations, FIRs. We are scraping them off the internet wherever possible and trying to analyze them. We've done 4 states so far, and we are adding, the work is in progress right now. We are adding more numbers as we are going along. And we have looked at what are classified in the Indian Penal Code as crimes against women. So there are 3 large categories that we are focusing on: rape. The other category that's defined in the Indian Penal Code is assault with intention to outrage their modesty. This is the government of India's words, not ours. And cruelty against women by husbands or relatives. This is the domestic violence. Now, I'm going to show you 2 graphs quickly on our results so far, and you will appreciate what I'm saying about the issue of interpreting numbers. So do the numbers reflect incidents of violence, or do their numbers reflect reporting? And here's my first graph, which is on cruelty by husbands or relatives, which is a violence that takes place inside the home. Okay. Now you see, we have plotted the figures for 2019. There's a number of cases, a 7-day moving average, and for 2020, and look at the comparisons. Now, until the first vertical line is when the first stringent nationwide lockdown got imposed, which is 24th of March. Now, if you see 2019 versus 2020, there are some differences until that point, but the lines are moving fairly similarly. Look at the segment now between the 2 vertical lines, which is the strictest lockdown that India had. And that was the strictest one, among the most strict in the world, where everything was shut down. And look at the massive gap between the 2019 figures and 2020 figures. It is impossible, this is 4 states and we are analyzing more data, but it is impossible to be convinced that domestic violence went down drastically in India in the strictest phase of the lockdown. And then it remained, the gap remains more or less, through in the remaining months as well. What this suggests to us right now is that this is not a decline in incidents. This is a decline in the ability of women to report. Okay, here's another graph, which is of rape. And it just records whether the woman who complained about rape or attempted to rape, we don't know the perpetrator. So it could be somebody outside the home, it could be somebody inside the home, but it's a complaint is filed of rape. Okay, most likely somebody outside the home, because marital rape as a legal concept is not yet recognized in India. And again, you see the period between the 2 vertical lines, which is 24th of March, and the phase of the ending of the first lockdown, which is the beginning of May. Okay, end of April actually, beginning of May, which is the strictest lockdown. And again, you see that gaping increase. Now this, if it is rape that's taking place outside the home, it is possible to believe that it's actually an incident story, because just because of the strict lockdown, people were not venturing outdoors. So, but again, we would not know that. There's no way to know that. But you look at the July onwards, a period where it's unlocked down has basically happened, at the nationwide level, and you find again that the trends are more or less back to, with some variation, back to the 2019 levels. So as constraints on mobility have lifted, you see that reports of rape have also sort of gone back more or less to the 2019 level. There's a period in between where you see a switch, and we are trying to analyze this switch, and we are also going to look at more data, and we'll see what the pattern is. But basically, I would urge you to focus on this strict lockdown phase where you see 2019 figures higher, much higher than the 2020 figures. And we believe that what this is showing is that the pandemic affected the ability to report domestic violence, at least in India. That seems to be the case. And that brings into question the robustness of institutional support, precisely at the time when the victims of violence need it the most. That is the time where the institutions seem to be failing. That's the time when they cannot access law enforcement agencies, health centers, shelters, all of these agencies. That's, when you need it the most, that's when they are failing the victims. So I think that we need to focus on the robustness of institutional support. So even at the best of times, these structures don't function as well as we think they ought to function. But certainly the cracks or the vulnerabilities in the system have been exposed, we believe, through this crisis. And even during the strictest lockdown, essential services were running. And what we want to argue is that support to victims of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, have to be defined as essential services. But for all this to happen, we need evidence and data in real time and a recognition of the problem. We don't see, and UN Women is saying it, a lot of women activists are saying it, women academics are saying it, but we don't see enough of an emphasis on this problem by governments. So this has to be recognized as a real problem. Data have to be released in real time. And we need to focus, in addition to the incidence of violence, we also need to focus on the robustness of institutional support. Are our institutional structures able to rise up to the challenge that COVID-19 has imposed? Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ashwini. That was a really fascinating presentation and really fascinating data that you've been collecting. I think what really struck me there is in terms of, the real constraints on reporting, is that the COVID crisis, at least in the Indian states that you've looked at, also reflects what we already see in conflict zones. So just to give you a couple of examples, in Rakhine State in Myanmar or in Mindanao in Philippines, those are the states in those two countries which have the lowest reporting of gender-based violence, precisely because it's virtually impossible to report. So I think that this also fits the pattern of what we know about crises in general. But I'd like to turn to Naomi now, because it would be really interesting to contrast with the research she's been doing in Victoria and Melbourne in terms of the institutional response and preparedness to address gender-based violence during COVID. Victoria has had a Royal Commission on Family Violence and has really put significant resources and funding into the family violence prevention sector. So one would think that we would be best placed in this state to actually prevent and respond to, to the challenges with reporting and being confined to homes. So Naomi, looking forward to hearing from you and how COVID-19 has impacted violence against women in Melbourne and in Victoria and Australia more broadly.
Sure, thanks for having me, Jackie, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all virtually meeting today and pay my respects to elders past and present. So I think as Jackie flagged in her introduction, we know from previous research that home is actually the most likely place where women and girls could be killed. And so for some, while home might have been a haven during the pandemic, for many women, it was the most dangerous place where the threat to their own personal safety behind closed doors looms the largest. And in fact, in Australia, domestic and family violence had already been declared a national emergency in 2015. And so with governments across the globe issuing these stay-at-home orders in an attempt to reduce the community spread of COVID-19, concerns were raised about the heightened risk to the safety of women and children in homes. And as Jackie has noted, the United Nations declared violence against women the shadow pandemic in April this year. And from some of the work that Jackie's previously conducted and other researchers, we knew also that in times of crisis, particularly natural disasters, that are associated with an increase in violence against women. So this led to this research that's been funded by Monash University as part of the Melbourne experiment, which I've been leading together with Professor Jackie Chu and Associate Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, where we've been investigating gender-based violence and help-seeking behaviours in Australia during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what we did is in April and May this year, when Victoria was under the first lockdown, so people were allowed to leave home for 4 reasons: to go shopping, to do daily exercise, and to provide care, and to go to work if they were unable to work from home. We surveyed 166 practitioners who were supporting women who were experiencing violence during the lockdown. And what our Victorian research demonstrated, unfortunately, was that the state of Victoria was no exception to the violence against women shadow pandemic. And our findings showed that there'd been an increase in the prevalence, severity, and complexity of violence against women that was reported to these practitioners since the onset of the COVID crisis. So we heard from practitioners, and 59% of these practitioners reported to us that COVID had increased the frequency of violence against women. 50% of practitioners reported that it had increased the severity of violence against women, and 86% of practitioners reported that it had increased the complexity of women's needs. And I think most notably, what we also found was that 42% of practitioners reported an increase in first-time family and domestic violence reporting by women. And our findings were echoed in the latest Victoria Police data that's just been released, which also showed an increase in police-reported domestic and family violence incidents in the first half of this year. But I think tying nicely to what was just previously presented is our research also showed that COVID-19 has provided perpetrators with new opportunities to exert power and control over women. And sadly, this often involves weaponizing children. So we heard stories from practitioners that perpetrators were using children to gain access to women, to force women to share premises with their abusers, to control their movements, and to isolate them from friends, family, and support services. We also heard from practitioners about the ways in which perpetrators were using the threat of infection and the COVID restrictions to perpetrate heightened violence against their partners. So we heard stories that perpetrators were forcing women to wash their hands to the point that they experienced cuts and bleeding. We also heard that some perpetrators were spreading rumours about women that they had COVID-19 so that they could further isolate their victims and so that no one would come near them and support them. And unfortunately, what our research in Victoria and in Queensland showed is that it's actually been incredibly challenging for women to seek help during the pandemic. And in addition to the significant disruptions to support services, many women have been isolating in homes with their abusers. And the practitioners told us that there'd been an increase in surveillance by perpetrators in the home and that they were monitoring women's access and use of communication technology, which in turn limited women's opportunities to seek help. And I think a further complication too with the stay-at-home directives was that there was just no guarantee of privacy in homes during the lockdowns. And many women didn't have a safe environment to seek support where they could talk openly and honestly about their situation. So we heard a lot of stories from practitioners about women and clients abruptly ending calls or changing the topic or telling them to call back later. And we also saw an increase in the helpline data with women calling very late at night, often when their children and the perpetrator were likely to be asleep. And so in addition to looking at how COVID had impacted the nature and incidence of violence against women in Victoria particularly, but also in other states in Australia, we looked at how domestic and family violence services had adapted and changed their practices in response to the COVID restrictions. And what we actually saw was that across the state of Victoria, domestic and family violence services have innovated to enhance the accessibility and effectiveness of service delivery during the COVID restrictions. So most agencies in Victoria have pivoted to phone, web and message-based service deliveries. We heard stories about agencies developing a partnership with Sheba, which is a female-run rideshare company to transport women and children who were fleeing violent relationships during the restrictions to safe accommodation. We also heard about organisations using police stations as drop-off and pick-up spots for providing material aid during the restrictions. And we also heard that many agencies developed alert systems with clients, such as code words and physical signals, so that women could communicate if they were at high risk and needed help without alerting the perpetrator to this. And these practices are particularly important during the stay-at-home directives. As practitioners told us, they often had a sense that perpetrators were in the homes, standing right next to the women and listening to their conversations. And they needed to develop ways that they could safely communicate with these women without their partners becoming aware of this. And I think probably something that might have largely been overlooked somewhat to date, that is a really important consideration that we need to think about in terms of this concept of the shadow pandemic, is that while domestic and family violence practitioners in Victoria and across Australia have worked tirelessly to respond to the increased demand and have pivoted to remote service delivery, what our research actually revealed was the significant toll that this has taken on practitioners who've been doing this incredibly difficult work of supporting women experiencing trauma and abuse from their homes. So practitioners talk to us about feeling heightened pressure and stress working during the COVID-19 restrictions because of the increased demand, and they express concern about potential burnout. And actually, we did a second survey in Victoria in July and August, which was in the second period of lockdown, which went for over 100 days. And we surveyed practitioners about their well-being and mental health. And what we found was that 70% of the 113 practitioners that we surveyed who were supporting women experiencing domestic violence reported that they were already experiencing moderate levels of burnout. And so what we wanted to do was get a deeper understanding of how working during this period and working particularly from home and remotely has impacted their well-being. And the practitioners talked to us about the fact that their clients were experiencing heightened risk and escalated forms of violence during this time. And they described it like having concrete heaped on their shoulders because of the high level of risk they were dealing with during the pandemic. And they also told us that their workloads has skyrocketed and that they were working longer hours to meet the demand. And they often talk to us in the focus groups about being tethered to their devices. So staying up for that late night phone call to make sure a woman's okay, or to do that safety plan when it might be safe to do at midnight when the perpetrator's gone to sleep. Our research also revealed that working from home has made it really challenging for practitioners to stay together as a support unit while working apart physically. So the practitioners that we surveyed in Victoria talked to us and told us that they felt isolated and lonely working from home, and they missed that incidental support and debriefing that's provided by colleagues. You know, the quick chat in the tea room, or when you see someone having a distressing call, you just turn over and debrief with them. And they emphasised to us how incidental support and debriefing is critical to your well-being and self-care practice when you're dealing with clients experiencing trauma and abuse. And finally, what our research showed was that bringing their family violence work into their homes has made maintaining professional and personal boundaries extremely challenging for practitioners, and it's undone many of their efforts to keep home their safe space. So they explained to us that working from home has blurred the boundaries between work and home, and they told us that family violence work is tainting their homes and invading their safe spaces. So I think, you know, one of the key things to consider moving forward in Australia's response to the coronavirus, but also internationally, is, you know, practitioners in the domestic and family violence sector in Australia, and I'm sure across the world, have worked tirelessly to meet this increased demand on the sector during this period of heightened risk. And these workers are the front line of the shadow pandemic. And we need to think about how we can prioritise their well-being to ensure that they're supported to provide this incredibly challenging yet vital service to the community. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Naomi. So some really important findings there, and I think a really interesting contrast to the findings from Ashwini from India, where you've actually seen increased reporting even during restrictions in Melbourne, in Victoria, which maybe speaks to the strength of some of those institutions and perhaps the greater awareness of the problem here. But nonetheless, I think the strain on the family violence service sector is significant and clearly cannot cope with the demand based on existing resources. But nonetheless, the service innovations are really, really interesting, and it would be good to know if some of those are also have also been picked up in India and Bangladesh. I'd like to turn to Jennifer Jabbar now to hear a bit about how BRAC in Bangladesh has been experiencing the shadow pandemic and what BRAC has been doing in response. Thank you very much, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jackie. I'm just sharing my screen and I'll start. Okay, thank you everyone. So I'd like to talk a bit about the Bangladesh experience. And if I first talk about BRAC, so you can understand the context on how I'm being able to show this Bangladesh experience. BRAC is the largest, BRAC Human Rights Legal Aid Services Program is the largest legal aid program in Bangladesh. And we have been working in the communities, supporting in access to justice and preventing child marriages, working in the communities, awareing people of their rights on domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and violence in the communities. Among the services we provide are legal advice, counseling, alternate dispute resolutions, fact findings, and victim support. And providing client follow-ups to the most marginalized and the vulnerable communities in Bangladesh. So if I show you, because all the speakers have spoken that there is data, I'd like to talk about some of the data that we have in 2019 and 2020, which can give you an indication of what has happened. So we cover 61 districts out of 64 districts in Bangladesh. Now for maintenance and dower, in 2019, for husbands who got basically divorced their wives or separated, we received 5.5 million on behalf of these vulnerable destitute women. But the compensation received in 2020 came down to 3.79 million. The number of complaints we received in 2019 was around 31,000. The complaints dropped in 2020 to 23,924. The alternate dispute resolutions, the mediations conducted by us was 21,000 plus in 2019. That dropped to 15,000 in 2020. The cases filed on behalf of beneficiaries was 3,000 plus, which dropped in 2020 to 1,700. And the number of people we could reach was over 100,000 in 2019, and this decreased to around 46,000 in 2020. 97% of our clients are women, and we deal with issues of family disputes and human rights violation incidents like rape, attempted rape, acid throwing, etc. So if you see the contrast, you see that there was a decrease. Now, there was a lockdown, and people accessing services, even accessing services of BRAC, was limited due to the lockdown period because they could not come to the legal aid clinics. So this, which basically Ashwini also said, that the incidents didn't drop, but people's access to legal services became a challenge. So if I go on to state that 5 billion people have unmet justice needs globally, and survivors of violence generally don't tend to seek access to justice for a number of reasons. There's stigmatization involved, the culture of acceptance, the lack of knowledge and gender dispositions of service providing, the time and cost prohibitions, limited access to formal institutions, fear of further violence. And then during COVID, what we found is that the situation became worse, and it affected a broad range of human rights, including accessing justice in a timely, fair, and an effective manner. On the global context, many people have already spoken. We know that 31 million additional cases of gender-based violence can be expected to occur if the lockdown continues, which is a UNFPA projection. For every 3 months, they say that 15 million extra cases of gender-based violence are expected. And we also see that 136 countries, out of 136, 104 countries reported a disruption in services related to violence against children. Around 2/3 of countries reported at least one disruption of service. And this is from the UNICEF's Social Economic Impact Survey. If I come straight to the Bangladesh context, from Jan to October, we have seen reports, 25,607 incidents were reported. Child marriage is also a gender-based violence, and our community empowerment program, which have people mobilized in the community, prevented 683 child marriages during Jan to September of this year. And the year before, it was only 371. So we see that it's almost doubled. Another organization, Monash Foundation, found 4,000 women and children were subjected to violence in 27 selected countries. And among them, we found that a number of women and 424 children had endured violence for the first time. Regarding rape incidents, 892 incidents of rape were recorded in the last 8 months. And the figure is much higher now because there's been sudden surge in the number of rapes and gang rapes which are reported. And we have 192 incidents of attempted rape. And we also have adolescent girls within this group. And this has been reported by the Bangladesh National Women Lawyers Association. Now, the pathways linking to VAWC, which many people have already said, we have a health crisis. Along with the health crisis comes the economic crisis. And with the economic crisis, people losing jobs, even the women who were working. And especially if you talk about domestic help, waste pickers, people in the informal economy, then people in the formal economy where Bangladesh has a huge R&D sector. People had lost jobs there also. And these, the economic hardship has basically brought in a social crisis. And this is where the women and the children being it's totally about a power relation. The women and children being in the house are the first targets to be subject to violence. And that is what we are seeing and what is coming out of our data. Quarantine was something that resulted in an inability of women to be able to move away from their abusive partners. And there was closure of shelter homes. Legal aid organizations had limited capacity. The courts were closed. And we saw that with the court closures for 3 months, March to June, it created a great problem for people to access justice. And we saw that there was social isolation. People were not able to reach to their neighbors. So the exploitative relationships were taking place. And law enforcement found this not to be that serious an issue, especially family disputes. If it was rape or attempted rape, they would take cognizance of those cases. If it was family disputes and people were being tortured at home, they would not take cognizance of those. So law enforcement were very busy in sort of engaging in the COVID response mechanism, and this was sort of overlooked. There was closure of educational institutions, which continues to take place, and it has an adverse effect on children. So if we come to access to justice, the nature of the judicial process itself is a challenge to function effectively in the context of a lockdown. Women's access to justice was severely impacted by the crisis due to closure of public transport. Women could not come out, and it was difficult for them to reach out for help. Cases of sexual violence and domestic violence and torture cases, family matters, were exposed because courts were closed or they had limited jurisdiction. They were only doing bail matters and looking into rape cases, but the absence of the regular courts and the limited access to one-stop crisis centers, which provide medical support and legal support and psychosocial support, was very limited during the initial couple of months of the pandemic. Still, the services are, it's not back to normal to the way it was pre-pandemic. So there is, the responses have slowed down, and VAWC responses were very much less prioritized by the local authorities and the police because they were involved with COVID responses. If we look at the societal symptoms, there's an increase in early marriage because people have lost jobs. What we're seeing is that they're getting the children married off at a very early age right now because it's just, they feel that it's just an extra mouth to feed. So we're seeing a surge in the number of child marriages, and this will have an effect on the sex ratio at birth. It will, the effects of these early child marriages will, we tend to see that the people who are married off early are victims of violence also. The higher number of, they're subject to more violence than people who are married off later. So it's projected that an additional 13 million child marriages are likely to take place between 2020 and 2030. Now, in this debt-ridden context where violence incidents are taking place and there's disputes of, say, selling of assets, unemployment, poverty, property disputes, we're seeing a surge in the number of divorces, and destitution of these women have increased. Bangladesh is also the 4th highest prevalence rate of child labor, child marriages, and we see that 59% of girls in Bangladesh are married before the age of 18 and 22% before the age of 15. So the reported cases of child marriages during this period of the lockdown, we saw that in April there were a surge in calls. We had 450 calls through the government hotline, and in March it was 322. So these are concerns. If you talk about, since we're the largest legal aid program, we also faced challenges during this pandemic situation. There were an alarming number of domestic violence and high number of human rights violation incidents. By human rights violation incidents, we talk about rape, attempted rape, acid throwing, and various other human rights violations. These were on the rise, but non-availability of services were there from the justice actors. Police were busy in lockdown, access to courts were very limited, and hence shelter homes were shut because they did not have isolation centers to keep people coming in and ensuring that they were isolated. People were busy with humanitarian relief work, and there was government policy chaos on the zoning. So reaching out to the communities was a challenge. On the operational side, there were restrictions from the local administration, so reaching out to the communities. Connectivity was a big problem in the remotest parts of the country. There was non-connectivity of the external stakeholders, such as the judiciary and the police, and then the beneficiaries did not find much confidence about the remotely offered services. So if I show you that the interventions that we had, we saw that the number of complaints that we generally received at the legal aid clinics, say from March to May in 2019 and March to May in 2020, there's been a 45% reduction. Complaints resolved through mediation, there's been a 52% reduction. From 2019 cases sent to court, there was a 78% reduction. Judgment of cases was 85% reduction. Amount recovered for maintenance and dower on behalf of women had reduced by 58%. But the number of reported incidents, we had around 20,000 reported incidents for maintenance, dower, and maintenance for children. And human rights violation incidents we received for murder after rape, polygamy, acid throwing, trafficking, gang rape, kidnapping, almost 3,000 cases we had received. Physical torture, attempted rape, and provoked suicide. What we tried to do was to immediately adapt in March to provide services over phone. So we brought about awareness and counseling and advice through phone, and we tried to do alternate dispute resolution through teleconferencing. We were successful in doing a number of mediations over teleconferencing, but still we felt that after the lockdown restrictions were lifted, there was a surge of people coming to the legal aid clinics trying to access services. And that we think is that they were more comfortable coming, and what we've asked them is that they said they are more comfortable coming face to face than being able to resolving disputes over mobile phones. Part of our work we do is we do fact findings of, say, human rights violation incidents. Generally, every year we do 2,200 fact findings of, say, rape, attempted rape, etc. But in 3 months itself, we did 1,123 human rights violation incidents fact finding, which we support the police with and the courts with. And that is an alarming increase. So yes, services reduced, but we also have those facts where the number of incidents have increased. Reduced services, but increased number of cases of human rights violations. So what were the long-term lessons that we learned from this? The justice sector was not prepared for such a doomsday scenario. There was absence of formal judiciary at the grassroots level, and this has been catastrophic. All justice actors did not function in a coordinated way. Government and NGO coordination lacked. NGOs did not coordinate among themselves, and there were insufficient number of paralegals, which weakened the overall legal empowerment through the pandemic. Way forward, this pandemic is just one instance which has given us a lesson that how should we work in the future. Going towards tech-based solutions and having larger outreach is very important. Developing awareness videos on various rights issues, intensive partnership building with the state and non-state actors is very important. We need to work in coordination. Activating the police station with women and children's desks so that they work as immediate responders. The virtual court system, which got introduced sometime in June, July of this year, this should have a permanent feature in our judiciary. And I think virtual courts actually sort of help to address some of these issues. Mobilization of the paralegals at the grassroots levels, and recognizing the role of women, women's economic empowerment in global recovery. Because the pandemic, we will get vaccine, but bringing about economic empowerment for these women will help to prevent violence against women and children. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that the effects of the COVID are likely to have a derail and the fragile progress we made towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this crisis calls for a renewed effort on SDG 16. We need to rethink on our activities so that we can ensure a more peaceful and just and inclusive society, and have a holistic approach to achieving and ensuring justice for people during such situations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm really, really pleased that you ended on the Sustainable Development Goals there. And I think they provide a really important framework for us to think about how to respond to any crisis, including this one, and how to ensure a really inclusive response to recovery. And I think what's really important about Sustainable Development Goals is that they require us to look at the multiple crises, the multiple inequalities and the multiple institutional responses that are required. And that clearly has not been the case for most governments during COVID-19, that the responses have to gender-based violence were not from the outset. We were not prepared, and the responses are not, adequate to deal with, the significant violence. I found really surprising and really very concerning from your presentation the reports that you have around doubling of child marriage, especially in a context where child marriage is a real significant problem for girls' and women's rights, livelihoods, and futures, and especially as an economic coping mechanism. How much our recovery is off the backs of girls and women. I also found really interesting the pattern especially between Australia and Bangladesh, and perhaps it would be good to hear about India as well, the substantial first-time violence, cases of first-time violence, really concerning there. I wonder about whether or not there's a common pattern with regard to the severity of violence, which Naomi pointed to in her presentation. And having heard a recent webinar from the justice sector in Melbourne, some of the examples of the severity of violence here are quite egregious, really, really severe violence. And I'm sure, some of these patterns may be reflected in your societies as well. But also, I think also really interesting to see how all of us have been using similar kinds of innovations, the virtual courts, the different flexible ways that BRAC has actually increased its work massively during this year. So, congratulations on, on your flexibility, on your ability to respond, especially, under, very difficult circumstances. We have a number of questions, which is fantastic, and I encourage everyone to keep your questions coming. I'm going to go to the first question, and perhaps I will ask Ashwini to respond first, but each of you, good to have your comments on this question here. The question comes from, it's anonymous, which is unfortunate, and it's a question about in developing countries, many women are not able to work or could not get enough food for their family because of job loss or their husband, family members' job loss. What do you think about the violence that is caused by food insecurity and related economic uncertainty? And how does the research, or can the research identify the extent of violence during lockdowns when face-to-face interviews are not possible, and asking women over the phone may cause further trouble? So good to know about the ways in which we can learn about address some of those data gaps that Ashwini talked about when we can't actually speak with victims, as well as what the impact of, a bit more about the impact of food insecurity and the economic crisis. Ashwini, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Jackie, and thank you for the question. So let me begin with the second part of the question, which is that what is the ethics of asking about violent encounters in the home over the phone? So, I think that we as researchers should be very careful about that. And in fact, I'm involved in another project where we are doing phone-based surveys in Madhya Pradesh, which is a state in India, in rural communities. And we are looking at the ability of women's self-help groups to provide a safety net to rural women and rural families. And we had a discussion within our research group about, should we ask our respondents over the phone whether they had been, suffered violence inside their home? And in the end, we decided not to do that. Because A, we don't know who's around the woman when she's on the phone. Secondly, even if she's alone at that time, if she's locked in with an abusive person, partner, anyone, even a suspicion that she spoke to somebody else can actually increase the risk of violence against her. So domestic violence research should be, I'm no expert here, but we just felt that we have to be very sensitive about how we conduct the research. So we decided against asking this question directly. But what we did ask is, we are also interviewing members of the village council, the Gram Panchayat as it's known in India, and the self-help groups functionaries. And we just asked them, what do you feel has happened? Do you feel that women are complaining to you, or have you heard of your neighbors or your friends or SHG members? And it's a perceptions question. It's not an actual incidence question. And I think that our research should never compromise the safety and well-being of our subjects. So we should definitely not ask this question on the phone saying, have you faced violence in the last, however well-meaning and well-intentioned that question can be. So the data that we get on violence has to come from women reporting themselves. And that is what I was focusing on earlier, which is that conditions should be enabling, where women who have been victims of violence should be able to go out and complain themselves or with their friends and families, rather than a researcher going and asking them, I understand that the question is very well-meaning, but I think it puts the victims at great risk. So I think that as researchers, we should definitely, and researchers, practitioners, whatever our capacities are, we should definitely not ask that question. So that's my response to the data collection question and research, doing research in real time. What was the first question? Sorry.
Maybe we'll just ask, Ashwini, why don't we just ask Jennifer and Naomi on that point about data and how do we get information when it's not safe to speak with victims? Jennifer, what are your thoughts?
Yes, we need to be very careful, and we have people in the communities reaching out, and we have community leaders where we educate them and they reach out to the communities. During the lockdown, since we were not able to reach out to the communities, and this was an issue, the community leaders are in the communities themselves. And people go around house to house. I mean, they are able to mobilize a little. So some of that was there. Yes, it's a big challenge that the intimate partner can be next to them and during calls. So rather than us reaching out, they reach out to us. They sort of reach out to us when their partner is not around at different times of the day. So when their partner goes out for a little while, that's when they sort of reach out, and then we sort of mobilize the community to reach out to them. But it was very limited during the first 3 months, which is why we had very little reportings happening. after June, when the lockdown was lifted, then we saw there was a huge surge. So there are limitations because you're locked in with the partner, and it's very difficult to actually reach out during that time. Which is why the data you see that the number of reports for a 3-month period was quite less, but it was a huge amount of violence was there. And that suddenly in our clinics, we had a surge coming when the lockdown lifted. So I think that sort of gives you the story. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Naomi, what are your thoughts and how have you been responding in terms of your research methods to the challenge?
Sure, I think, echoing what the others have said, we had ethical and safety considerations in terms of, prioritising your desire to get first-hand accounts of women's experiences of violence during this time versus the fact that we supported as a research team that if women have an opportunity to seek support, that they should be prioritising access to support rather than participating in research. And I think what our work with practitioners really highlighted was that so many women and children during the lockdowns, and so in Victoria, our research was conducted at the 2 lockdowns, which have been some of the longest lockdowns in the world, where women and children and families were only allowed to leave once a day, one household member to go shopping or 1 hour a day to walk, and within a restricted kilometre radius of their home. And what we found when talking to practitioners really just confirmed our concerns was that you can't ensure privacy or confidentiality in homes during this time. And so from our point of view as a research centre, we didn't think it was ethically appropriate or safe to collect first-hand accounts. And I think, we really needed to be guided as researchers as that principle of do no harm. And we can't guarantee that we will not do no harm. As Ashwini highlighted, what if we've seen an increase in technology monitoring? So even if they are able to speak with us, what if the perpetrator looks at their browser history or their phone history and that triggers an incident? I think we really need to be mindful of that fact. Despite our desire for robust data, we will have opportunities to collect first-hand accounts at a later time when it's safer for women and children to do so, and when they've got supports in place. And many of the validated scales for measuring intimate partner violence are based on reflections. It's a 12-month reflection on what you've experienced in the past 12 months. So I don't think that there's an issue in terms of that. So that was really what led to our decision primarily to focus on service provider data through the reflections and observations of these key informants, these frontline practitioners during these lockdowns. And I think, as Jennifer noted, we did see, as restrictions eased slightly in May this year in Victoria, we saw an increase in reporting as women were able to go out of the home for more reasons and felt safer to go and report in person. And then unfortunately, we went back into an even stronger lockdown. But what we've seen from the most recent police data is that as these now stronger lockdown has been easing, we're again seeing an increase in reporting. So I think we'll have to look at, in terms of prevalence studies, that will be at a later time when the safety considerations aren't so high.
Thank you very much, Naomi. I'd like to now there's a question specifically for Jennifer. And it's about how is BRAC collaborating with the Bangladesh government to minimise gender-based violence during the pandemic, as many people are pushed to unemployment and family incomes are reduced drastically. How is BRAC supporting the victims and vulnerable groups? I think you already told us how you're supporting, but what are you doing with the government to increase that support? Jennifer, you are muted.
Sorry. So yes, we're working with the government on a number of streams. We're working in collaboration with the district legal aid committees, where we make reference to mediations and case support. We're supporting the public prosecutor in criminal cases. We do fact finding for the magistrates. So we're collaborating on a number of fronts with the justice sector. Not only that, during the pandemic, because the police were so busy in lockdown, enforcing the lockdown, any family dispute cases that went to the police station, they said go to BRAC, so that BRAC could sort of do the mediations on the family dispute. So we sort of supported the police during that time. BRAC has a huge relief work going on, where we're supporting in food and cash support to the marginalized communities. Not only that, it's for skilling and for reskilling. We have programs going on, and we have microfinance support. We have our Ultra Pro graduation program. So sort of supporting people in the communities for addressing issues where they want to get some microfinance support and basically do something for themselves. So we're helping on a number of fronts, because the model that we operate on is prevention, which is bringing awareness on the rights, protection, which is providing the legal aid services, which is case management support, and providing alternate dispute resolution in collaboration with the government. Partnerships, working with the government and with NGO organizations, and reintegration, which is the empowerment part of reskilling and microfinance. So that is how we operate our program, and we work with the governments on this. So we did work to sort of with other NGOs to get the virtual court system running, and also seeking help from the police to activate the police desk for women and children, so that everyone doesn't go enforcing lockdown, because some people have to address violence against women and children. So these are some of the things that we sort of worked around. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I really appreciate your time with us today. And I know you have to leave a little early, so greatly appreciate all of your insights. And it would be wonderful to be able to share your presentation, because there was, you know, a lot of rich insight there, and I even did the screenshots. So would be very happy to have that.
Sure.
I think we might just come back to this previous question, Ashwini, with regard to
May I leave, Jackie? Is it okay if I could leave now?
Yes, absolutely, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and all the best.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Ashwini, I'd just like to turn back to the earlier question which we had about the impact of food insecurity, job loss, economic uncertainty, and how that is fueling violence, you know, in the family against women. Really good to have your thoughts on the causal mechanisms there.
So it's you know, so for the COVID period, nobody has done a causal analysis, and it's not even possible in the short time, right? Because the problem is that the data is what is reported, you know. So you can't, supposing the numbers have gone down, as I've shown in my graphs, in at least these 4 states for which I have data, to conclude from there that domestic violence has gone down, we don't know that, right? We believe it's a reporting story. And so the causal, as the way economists understand causal, there are issues related to establishing causality. But in the past, from other contexts, these are all risk factors. So when families feel vulnerable, increase unemployment, you know, social pressures, lack of food, these increase the risk factors. But having said all this, we should not emphasize, I think, in my view, the notion of poverty or deprivation as causal mechanisms for domestic violence. We should not overemphasize them. Because if this was the case, then in rich families, you would never have domestic violence. Or in richer societies, you would not have domestic violence. You know, from where we sit, the average GDP in Australia is very, very high, right? And so if you look at Indian poverty line, nobody's poor in Australia, right? And so if absolute deprivation, absolute material deprivation is seen as a primary driver of domestic violence, I think that would be a very incorrect conclusion. That would be a very incorrect conclusion, because we do in fact see violence against women in richer countries, in richer neighborhoods, in richer families. So whether you're a celebrity or not, or whether you're rich or not, at the heart of domestic violence, or violence against women and children in homes, lie a lot of reasons, including power, including misogyny, and the whole thrust to deny that also really comes from what are you saying? So there is a view about what women's role in society and in families is. And whenever you feel that women are deviating or are at the threat of deviation, or just to control them to be in that space, there would be violence. So I would not overemphasize so I understand that these are risk factors, and we at the end of it, we will never know for sure, because establishing causality is hard. But I would not overemphasize poverty or deprivation or unemployment as risk factors, because then it is an excuse for the rich to see themselves, so for example, in India, you see the problem of sex-selective feticide, which is illegal, but it thrives. That's one of the big factors when you see the imbalanced sex ratio. But in India, if you look at the imbalanced sex ratio, it's higher in richer neighborhoods, higher in richer districts and richer parts of India than in poorer. So that's an extreme form of violence against the girl child. And it's certainly not poverty that's driving it.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for those comments. That's really important to remember, and especially with the comparison with Australia. Naomi, there's a question here I think you could best address, and it asks, what supports would you suggest based on your research for practitioners seeking support in Australia?
Sure. I mean, whilst we heard that it's been incredibly challenging for practitioners to respond to this increased demand, we did hear about some really great initiatives that were being piloted. So a lot of the service providers in Victoria moved to online platforms to do team meetings and catch-ups, so things like Microsoft Teams and Zoom. And so what they were doing was they were scheduling remote reflective practice sessions, and they were scheduling weekly or daily debriefing. And they were also doing things like, what really highlighted from our research wasn't just that formal debriefing, but that informal debriefing that you have among colleagues and team workers in kitchens, when you grab a coffee. So they were trying to replicate those sort of talks. So they did like virtual tea time, virtual coffee sessions. We also heard one agency where they developed this sort of well-being buddy system where practitioners were paired up with another colleague, so they stay connected. And I think most importantly, what they talked about was not putting the burden on individual practitioners to pick up the phone and call their manager, that the onus was on them to tell them that they weren't struggling. So they were trying to be proactive and have these measures so that the managers or their co-worker was actively checking in with them each day. And also what they talked about was how incredibly grateful they were to agencies that allowed them to be flexible with their work time and their work hours. So, if they, while we were in the lockdown, if they wanted their 1 hour of outside time to be when the sun was up in the middle of the day, they could work early in the morning, have their, mental space and the exercise, which they all said was key to their mental health, in the middle of the day, have a break, and then go back to dealing with their trauma work. The other thing we saw was a lot of agencies introduce additional leave days, and that these leave requirements didn't require them to, provide any reason. They could just say, I need to have a mental health day, and they were given that day off. So I think those key things about flexible work arrangements, particularly what we saw in Australia, was we have a female dominant family and domestic violence workforce. So about 80% of them are women. And they also were responsible for homeschooling because we saw school closures during our 2 lockdowns. So having flexible work arrangements, allowing these practitioners to also balance their homeschooling and childcare responsibilities, and also to maintain their mental health. So allowing them to, you know, when they needed to take a break, to have time out, to take leave. And actually several agencies we walked to were actively encouraging workers to take leave, even though there was some reluctance sometimes because we were in a lockdown and you couldn't go on a typical holiday. But the importance of having time away and turning off your computer and turning off your phone, and, you know, having a space away from dealing with trauma and abuse. So they're some of the suggestions I would recommend in terms of trying to support practitioner wellbeing. And we are working with the peak body in Victoria, Domestic Violence Victoria, to develop some practice guidelines about how to support practitioner wellbeing during times of crisis and remote service delivery. So we'll be releasing those soon, and we can share the website with you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Naomi. We have another question here. Ashwini, I think you would be best placed to answer it. And it's just with regard to the restriction of access to sexual and reproductive health services and leading to an escalation of unplanned pregnancies, and many as a consequence of coerced sex, which is of course rape, and whether or not in India sexual and reproductive health services have been designated as essential services during COVID.
So yeah, that is a huge risk, and we'll have to look for the data on this. But yeah, there particularly in the first month and a half, access to all kinds of health services was severely restricted. And even now, people are postponing what they consider non-essential health interventions because you just don't want to catch the disease, basically. That's, you know, so, there's that as well, which is that even if you could go to the hospital, you will not go because, it's just better not to have to go there. I believe there was a notification in during the lockdown of designating some of the services as essential services, because particularly access to contraception. Whether that, to what extent that played a role, etc., we'll have to look for the data on that. But I think there was at least some recognition by the National Commission for Women in India to designate some of, access to some essential contraception as essential service, so that women could access it. But it's a huge issue. I mean, one of the big challenges that India is going to face is about early childhood, diseases. Like India had almost eradicated polio through vaccination, and this year, even though polio vaccines tried to continue, but I'm sure that it has been affected. TB treatment has been affected. So very important public health crises are looming large, even as COVID comes under control.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ashwini. And I think, of course, the shadow pandemic is itself a public health crisis, which is also occurring. Sure. And I think, look, thank you very much for your comments, and thank you very much to Naomi. And unfortunately, Jennifer had to leave us. But I think it's so important to have this kind of interdisciplinary cross-country conversation about a common global challenge. Just to finish up, I want to go back to start with one of your comments, Ashwini, that social norms do not seem to explain the outcomes, because obviously we might have differences in our social norms. We might be closer to supporting gender equality in Australia, yet we still have very poor outcomes when it comes to the prevention of violence against women. At the same time, I think one attendee has asked us, what kinds of effective interventions does the panel see that would address the root causes of violence against women? And if I might just finally finish up by answering that briefly, I think we do have evidence that gender equality, not simply in the family, but also in the broader society, in the political system, in the economic system, and in the health system, are all essential to addressing the causes of violence against women. And societies where women do have a good social status, economic status, they are much less likely to be vulnerable to violence. Even though violence against women crosses socioeconomic class lines, as Ashwini has mentioned. So I think that really what's really important in going forward in the so-called post-COVID normal phase and in recovery is to seriously think about the institutions and the policies that support recovery of societies, and that this includes an attention to gender equality in all responses. And certainly as part of that, as part of the justification for gender equality being simply to prevent this widespread violence against women and children. Thank you very much, Ashwini, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, Dr. Naomi Fitzner, and thank you very much to the Centre for Development Economics, led by Professor Asad Islam, for hosting us today. It's wonderful to have this conversation. I hope it will be the first of many that Monash hosts. And I wish you all the best in your ongoing research and addressing some of these really important data gaps, knowledge gaps, in order to contribute to the prevention, to the reduction of this violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Ashwini, and thank you, Naomi. Thank you all.